Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War news update. I guess this is a breaking news update really for the 27th of October 2024. And this is concerning the Georgia election. I did a breaking news update last night talking about the violence that was involved in the polling process, in the electoral process in Georgia, and that it was not looking good. I said there are two ways this can go. Georgian dream, accept reality, and accept a free and fair election, the results thereof, and take the country in a direction that its population broadly wants. Or they rig the election, do their violence, take pages out the dictatorship playbook, and really take the country in a Russian direction. And it has clearly been the latter, and it was always going to be the latter. People, when they have power, unfortunately, unless there are checks and balances in place, and especially if Russia is behind every move you do, generally want to hold on to that power. And this is an absolute travesty for the West, for freedom, for the EU, for Europe, for democracy, for all the good things that we want in the world we should be striving for. This is a movement towards a growing Russian influence, and that is the influence of an autocratic dictatorship under the rulership of Vladimir Putin. So here we saw, before the election took place, I reported all the violence that was taking place. Local journalists document blatant election violations in Georgia. Some ballots were reportedly spoiled by pen marks left in the column for the Georgian Dream Party. If voters select a different party on such ballots, their votes are considered invalid. Additionally, election observers are allegedly kicked out of some polling stations, with reports of physical altercations. Cases of voter intimidation are also documented, with activists accompanying voters directly into the booth. I mean, we saw ballot stuffing, we saw people getting beaten up, we saw those wanting to vote, or those who are members of Georgian Dream, or registered Georgian Dream voters, being given 2 ballots instead of 1. All sorts of stuff was going on yesterday. This was going to be the most spurious of elections. We then heard, and this was after I did my video yesterday, that Georgia's largest opposition party, United National Movement, reported an attack on its office by the Tatushki. So that, remember, the Tatushki are these Russian, invariably Russian thugs that are paid up by the Kremlin to go and cause all sorts of issues. They often work alongside, say, the riot police, and do the stuff that riot police can't do, because that will be seen, if it's caught on camera, it'd be seen as the Georgian, in this case, the Georgian police doing X, Y, and Z. This happened in the Euromaidan protests as well. So you had the Ukrainian riot police effectively doing X, Y, and Z, but you had these Tatushki working alongside them that were doing it, covering their faces usually, although you don't see that here, but they do it with impunity, and it's not the official government it's not the actions of the official government forces, etc., etc. So this is a typical technique, typical mechanism used by the Kremlin. So supporters of the ruling pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party are accused of doing this attack. The attackers arrived in cars, and central office of the UNM began to break through and provoked a massive fight. So that happened. We had Mariam Doligie, a representative of the Unity National Movement, that same party, who was monitoring an election precinct in Tbilisi, was beaten. Currently, she is in hospital. The MIA states that they have no information about the incident, of course. And as Timofey Milovanov, the former Minister for the Economy for Ukraine, said, good news, today Georgia held a critical election determining whether its future aligns with Russia or Europe, despite pro-Russian supporters violently attacking observers. A very Russian tactic. Polls show over 50% for the pro-Western opposition. So this is what it looked like early doors. Edison Research exit poll shows opposition parties collectively with a 51.9%, while the ruling Georgian Dream party has 40.9%. Yet a centre close to the Georgian Dream Party released an exit poll with a radically opposite forecast. This suggests that the government might try to falsify elections in its favour against the pro-Western opposition. However, Edison Research Survey covered nearly 15,000 voters across the country, excluding occupied territories. Yes, there are Russian occupied territories in Georgia too, with a margin of error of just 2.5%, making their results quite reliable. So that's what Edison Research's survey found. But it didn't really go the way of, unfortunately, freedom and fairness. Polling stations closed in Georgia. Both ruling party and opposition claim victory. An exit poll by Edison Research, as mentioned, showed the Georgian Dream Party with only just over 40% of the vote, while opposition parties combined received over 50%. However, a separate poll from the pro-government Imedi TV channel reports Georgian Dream with over 56% of the vote. And then that was widely reported in a number of places. But unfortunately, it seems like the country has been forced into confronting a falsified election. So Georgia's Central Election Commission currently gives, and this was before it was over, Georgian Dream almost 53% of the vote, with 70% of the votes counted, and then it just got worse from there. Anton Gerashchenko said polling stations are closed in Georgia. Data from exit polls is contradictory. President Zarashvili says the opposition has won. That is the president, not the prime minister. The president is not of the Georgian Dream Party and is favouring accession to the EU. However, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, congratulates the Georgian Dreams party, the current ruling party. So we'll get onto this in a second with Viktor Orban. The situation in Georgia is rather tense. According to polls, people's moods are mixed and contradicting. While Georgians are afraid of a war with Russia and the Georgian Dream uses that to its advantage, most Georgians are pro-EU integration and at the very least do not want to lose their visa-free access to the Schengen area. Geopolitical stakes are very high. If Georgian Dream remains in power, monumental changes in the Caucasus region cannot be ruled out. The Kremlin has been hinting for quite some time that it can approve the return of South Ossetia and Abkhazia into Georgia with a special status and broad rights. It's quite clever of the Kremlin, which is to give Georgia back its annexed regions, but obviously on the proviso that it is completely subservient to Russia, I guess. If that happens, Ivanishvili, head of the Georgian Dream, will be able to announce the restoration of Georgia's territorial integrity. Moscow is very keen on having a pro-Russian Georgian government. That would mean a key country in the Caucasus in the Russian sphere of influence. Crucial logistical routes go through there, e.g. the route of oil transport from the Caspian Sea to Turkey and Europe. It would also mean the possibility to restore railroad connection of Russia with Armenia and then all the way up to Iran. So that in turn would mean a direct land corridor between Russia and Iran. Then a transport corridor north-south, Russia north, Caucasus, Iran, India, Sri Lanka. So Georgia is a key element in Russia's potential ability to influence India. Tbilisi turning around would definitely influence Armenia's geopolitical course. It will then be completely surrounded either by enemy countries, Azerbaijan and Turkey, or by Russia's allies, Iran and Georgia. But the most important consequence of pro-Russian powers winning in Georgia is that Russia would showcase itself as the only one able to guarantee security and territorial integrity of post-Soviet states, even for those with whom it previously waged wars. A lot of people fully realise how dangerous a victory of the Russian world would be. So the fight at the Georgian elections was intense. We will see how events will unfold. This gives you a really good insight into global geopolitics. And this is why I get really frustrated when people play down the importance of anything going on in the world, really. But I have arguments with people like, oh, Russia doesn't mean anything to us in America. They're like, okay, fair enough. Well, if you just want to allow Russia to continue gathering influence in the area, then and making these countries subservient to them, and then all of these railroad routes and gas and oil routes go through from one country to the other, etc., then they build up a solid political empire. And 20 years down the line, you'll be like, oh yeah, no, oh I see, oh Russia really were important, weren't they? Okay, they were quite meaningful to our states, our, I guess, international trade situation, our international foreign diplomatic situation, etc., etc. So this is super important, and there are many ways that this is important that we may not have otherwise realised, as talked about here by Anton Koryshchenko so eloquently. That's really well set out there. This is an incredibly important election, and it has been stolen by Russia. It's as simple as that. So we had this, and this is where I'm going to have a little bit of a freaking rant here. So here we have Ambassador Jonathan Viesyov, who is Secretary General of the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, saying, slightly premature, isn't it? The polls have only just closed and the votes have not yet been counted. But you had Viktor Orban congratulating Prime Minister Kobajidze and the Georgian Dream Party on their overwhelming victory in the parliamentary elections today. This is Viktor Orban's tweet. The people of Georgia know what is best for the country and made their voice heard today. And this was community noted. At the time this post was written, the CEC of Georgia has not published any data. So, as in the Electoral Commission, he announced the victory for the Georgian Dream and congratulated them before the vote count. So this is Viktor Orban doing dictatorship, autocracy 101. You got Philip O'Brien here saying, and worth noting that Putin's great friend Viktor Orban, whom Trump called fantastic, a friend, a great man and a great leader, has already endorsed the Georgian Dream, stealing the election before a single vote was counted. Okay, this is where I get ranty, right? Because I am super frustrated at the state of US politics and how 50% of the country appear to be attempting to validate Trumpian rhetoric and Trumpian ideology. And you have Donald Trump himself waxing lyrical about Viktor Orban. You and I here know, all of us know that Viktor Orban's a bad guy. He's a bad ruler. Like, in terms of autocracy versus freedom and liberty, autocracy versus democracy. He has curtailed the judiciary. He has curtailed freedom of speech through controlling the press. He has curtailed education in terms of free, enlightenment education. There, he has turned the country into an autocracy essentially, and he's a dictator wannabe. He's on the way to that label. This is obvious, right? So all of us see what Viktor Orban says concerning Ukraine. We see that he is a puppet of Putin. We all know this. This is an absolute no-brainer. So when you have your guy Trump going, Viktor Orban's my number one guy, and Viktor Orban has just, before the election results have been called in Georgia, has said congratulations Georgian Dream, just because that's what Putin wants to hear. How can you sit and go, yeah, Trump's my guy. Trump's my guy. He really knows how to do international politics. And here's a guy that is just obsequiously bootlicking Viktor Orban. Just absolutely adulating this autocrat. He gets prime seat at CPAC, at the Conservative Conference. CPAC takes place in Budapest, in Hungary, because Viktor Orban is your man. If you don't see how freaking compromised Donald Trump is, you judge people by who their friends are. If your friends are, and he's just said it again yesterday, he was, question on who talking about these dictators as enemies. He said, actually, the enemy within is greater. Like, if you have someone that's standing up and saying, we've got greater threat from half my own population than from Kim Jong-un, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, then I can't help you. I can't help you. So Philip O'Brien is absolutely right here. This is a really important thing to point out. It's worth noting that Putin's great friend, Viktor Orban, who has just tried to validate an illegally obtained electoral result, if Trump is calling him fantastic, a friend, a great man and a great leader, then you've got to start questioning your own judgment in supporting Trump, who supports these dictatorships. You really, really do. Because I worry about stuff like this. This is at the moment, unless there are protests that overturn this, and that's what I hope, because it's the only way it appears, we have lost Georgia to Russia. So what seems to be happening in Georgia is a dictator's playbook, says Philip O'Brien, seen recently in Belarus. You lose an election but claim victory. Then you use the security services to crack down brutally and assert your power. The question is whether friends of Georgia and democracy will do anything. This is where how we react is going to be important. Do we just sit back and let it happen? The problem is, you start getting involved, then you can be accused of trying to overturn electoral free and fair elections, even though they're not free and fair, right? So this is a really difficult path to navigate safely for the West, for the EU and for the US. Exit poll results showing that Georgian Dream had 40%, and then you've got the announcement from I think is at the TV, the pro-Russian, that's Georgian Dream, I think. Exit poll results of the pivotal parliamentary election in Georgia, where both the ruling pro-Russian Georgian Dream and opposition have claimed victory. All but pro-government Ahmedi Centre, show combined victory of opposition parties. So this here is what the falsified results are, and this is what you can assume the real results more properly looked like. Now, Marika Mikiashvili, Foreign Affairs, lecturer, PhD student, CE Europe and Central Asia Governance, etc., etc., etc. Strong Georgia Coalition says the official election results do not reflect the will of the Georgian people and will continue to fight with all democratic means. Prior, Coalition for Change and Unity National Movement, those are three parties, declare the elections illegitimate. Waiting for Georgia, the President Zurabishvili, and a crucial position of international observers and Western governments now. It's going to be very important to see what happens. It's vital that we do something, that we stand with the Georgian people whose votes have been overturned effectively. And she says also there are some reports that Georgian Dream might have rigged around 300,000 to 400,000 votes, or up to 20% of the total share based on turnout, through multiple voting with a single ID card, and God knows what they did to hack the electronic machines, and with the finest Kremlin guidelines. Disappointing official Belgian VRT News accepting or reporting official figures of the CEC. Some anecdotal mention of irregularities without mention of the massive extent of the falsifications, even insinuating opposition are bad losers. So there you go. We are going to see what goes on in Europe in terms of who is aligned to nationalist movements that are themselves aligned to Russia. So, if you're a news source that's aligned to sort of AFD, Rassemblement National, Belang Vlaams in Belgium, talking about Belgium. If you're aligned to those sort of sources, then you are going to be aligned to those sort of political movements. You are going to be aligned to Russia, and therefore reporting the results in favour of Georgian Dream. As a ruling, says Euromaidan Press, as a ruling Georgian Dream claims victory in a pivotal election that could send Georgia on a pro-Russian trajectory, the largest NGO election monitoring coalition backs the opposition's claims that the vote was stolen. So this is Transparency International. Of course, that index that Transparency International will do in terms of corruption is incredibly important. As a result of the analysis of the environment in the pre-election period and the fraud schemes used on the election day, as well as unprecedented impact on the will of the voters and the facts of violence, we believe that the preliminary results published by the Central Election Commission do not reflect the will of the citizens of Georgia. So that is and they have a larger statement, but basically, we can read a little more here. The election day took place in the context of serious and substantial violations. At the end of the day, it became clear that the various problems identified during the monitoring the election process during the day were part of a larger scheme, the purpose of which was to subvert the final result of the election. It became clear that a complex scheme of election fraud has been developed, for the implementation of which such methods were used as disruption of the verification system, violation of marking procedures, and obstruction of observers from observing voter identification procedures. In the first half of the day, 2 or more ballots were given to voters en masse. Also, there were cases where ballots were already selected in favour of a ruling party. It became obvious that the pre-election period, numerous reports and media reports about the confiscation of renting of ID cards, as well as the collection of personal data, served the purpose of implementation of the mentioned scheme. Due to such manipulations, it became possible to obtain a decisive number of votes in favour of the ruling party, which we can now see in the results of counting electronic machine checks published by the on the CEC website. During the day, unprecedented pressure was exerted on the representatives of the monitoring organisations. There were physical attacks, verbal abuse, intimidation, expulsion from the electoral precincts without reason. In most cases, it was impossible to observe the voting process. In some cases, it was even necessary to evacuate the observers. There were cases where the police were also involved in the process of expelling the observer. Consequently, the created environment made normal observation of the election process impossible. Journalists also became victims of violent attacks. Obstructing the journalists at the polling stations while they were undertaking their professional duties served the purpose to prevent fraud schemes from being detected during the election process and the public not to have information about these facts. On the day of voting, there was a concentration of unauthorised persons in the polling stations and their surrounding areas who were particularly aggressive towards both voters and observers. As always, this time too, in order to pressure and intimidate the voters, the ruling party used criminal groups. During the day, neither the election administration nor the law enforcement bodies reacted to the gross facts of the violation of law. There was a clear impression that the persons involved in rigging the elections had guarantees that no one would raise a question of their responsibility, even though they committed crimes. The ruling party carried out an unprecedented mobilisation of voters by means of vehicles. Unprecedented pressure was exerted on voters, taking into account that during the pre-election period, voters' personal information was collected, including their social and family status. A large number of voters were literally hostages of the ruling party. Moreover, the polling process was deliberately collapsed due to the lack of sufficient space and the lack of registrars at the polling stations outside Georgia. Voters had to stand in line for hours. Many of them did not even manage to vote, which means depriving our fellow citizens living abroad of their right to vote. As of 10:30 at night, we received the following information from the observers: 347 notifications about the facts of non-implementation of marking and voting without marking, violation of voting secrecy, 89 notifications, 341 cases of presence of unauthorised persons in the area were recorded, physical confrontation, threats of violence, 96 cases, 163 cases of restriction of observation rights of my vote observers. So just to put that in context, I imagine in the UK, you'd probably have zero of all of those, or near enough. And this is a and those were the reported ones. There'll be many that weren't reported. Coalition has identified election districts where substantial violations in the voting process had a systematic character, which could have a significant impact on the free expression of the voters' will. Substantial violations included: 1. Violation of voting secrecy; 2. Voting instead of someone else and repeatedly; 3. Impossibility of observing the correctness of the verification process and the registrar's activities; 4. Handing out more than one ballot per voter and or placing it in a box; 5. Physical violence; 6. Control of the manifestation of voters' will; 7. Damage to the mobile ballot boxes and ballots; 8. Non-implementation of marking procedures; 9. Agitation by the members of the commission; 10. Disrupting the activities of observers and expelling them; 11. Stuffing of ballots in the boxes. And then it lists all the districts. For now, 244 complaints have been filed and 183 notes have been made in the record book regarding the violations observed at the polling precincts. Really good work by Transparency International there. And it shows the sheer scale of this. And meanwhile, the Georgian parliament has said that they will approve the government despite protests by the opposition. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze said on October 27th as his party declared victory in the elections. Former Prime Minister Georgia Gakaria, the chair of the opposition Gakaria for Georgia party, said that the announced results do not reflect the will of the Georgian people and call for reasonable forms of protest to defend the European future of the country. And pro-European opposition parties, UNM, Coalition for Change, refused to recognise the results of the Central Election Commission, which declared the pro-Russian party Georgian Dream the winner. In the first reactions to Bokochava, chair of the Tina Bokochava, chair of the UNM opposition party, stated, quote, "The victory was stolen from the Georgian people." A coalition of election observers has declared that the election results in Georgia are fraudulent and should be annulled. They cite widespread violations, including merry-go-rounds observed across the country, says Nexter. And Mikko Mikkelsen, who is a chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament, says Georgia's apparent election results falsification makes it impossible to recognise their legitimacy. By rigging elections, one cannot join the European Union, but can end up back in Russia's embrace. And this is a problem, is that if you reject Georgia without helping them, say, well, that's you can't come into the EU because of all of these things that you've done, absolutely correct, like you can't. But if you kind of push them away, then that just helps them go towards Russia. How do you help those people recognize their democratic rights and will, and without kind of invading the country, either kind of virtually or conventionally. You know, it's so difficult to find out how best to deal with this, carrot and stick. But yeah, if you use a stick, you push them to Russia, and that's the issue. The Georgian opposition has rejected the results. We are outraged by the Central Commission, what the Central Commission dared to publish. These results do not reflect the will of the Georgian people, says Anna Dolice, leader of Strong Georgia. Prominent NGOs, non-governmental organisations who observed the election also refused to recognise the results, which show the pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party with a 54.24% after 97% of the votes were counted. Actually, it seems like it's probably a little bit more than that in the end. So that's the issue. I speculate that we are going to see violent protests, or protests that will end up being violent because they're cracked down on very hard by the government. It's going to be a fractious time in Georgia. This is an inflection point, I think, yet another one in the region. The West, the EU, UK, US desperately want the Georgian people's will to be reflected in a free and fair election, and the results that come about or should come about. We really do want Georgia to be in our sphere of influence, and this is Autocracy 101. And of course, Viktor Orban is going to be riding on the coattails, shouting to the world, or really to the Kremlin, his exaltations of support for Georgia Dream. This is a dangerous time we live in. The Ukraine war is obviously showing that, but the echoes of the earthquake in Ukraine, those aftershocks are being felt all across the region. What will happen, I don't know. But anyway, that's enough for me. Take care, guys. Speak soon.